All right. We 2 days after Easter, our trip started, and it started with I'd say with a bang, but it was the opposite of a bang. The plane, instead of flying to San Luis Obispo, flew to Santa Barbara, and then there was no gas truck to fill it up, so we just sat there for 2.5 hours. Got to Phoenix, ran to our plane, just made it. And of course, that was now midnight, so we got into DC somewhere about 7, 8 in the morning, and made it to the hotel, which obviously at 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock in the morning isn't ready. So we just stored our stuff and went to Arlington, and our day started, and there was a lot of interesting things. I mean, not just from the standpoint of seeing the Smithsonian here and the Smithsonian there, and the Washington and the Lincoln and the Jefferson, and all of those things, yes, but there's also the human aspect in the understanding that you're in the place, the seat of authority. And the red hat, Kathy didn't want me to wear it to DC because of the potential affiliation. And it was real interesting. I'm really glad I wore it because we got to see people's responses to red hats. And I was a bad guy until I turned around and they saw that it only said Washington, D.C. It didn't say Make America Great or Trump. Those that wore those hats, interestingly enough, were accosted in a variety of ways. And we were privy to that, able to be privy to that because, you see, we were safe. My hat said Washington, D.C. It didn't say Trump. So we must be good people. My point is, everybody, as soon as you say government, or you say Trump, or you say Obama, or you say Reagan, or you say Clinton, everybody immediately has a response inside. And unless you really are an ambivalent type of person, you either do this to one or you do this to the other. So this hat, yeah, it's neutral, well, for the most part, but even Washington, D.C. itself has a implication to some around the world. We stayed in the hotel that the plane that hit the Pentagon knocked the top sign off as it came down. So we were real near the Pentagon and the cemetery. Today we are talking about government and dealing with governing authorities. Can I honestly tell you that I've been anticipating this with great joy? No. But it has been an interesting journey for me as well, and I hope for you. Because when it gets down to it, whether this says something you like or something you don't like, you and I have an accountability and a responsibility to God first. And when we get that, we will be able to deal with the other things. I purposely started today, or had Dean read verses 11 and 12, because we have to jump back into this. This was before Easter. This was before Palm Sunday that we covered verses 11 and 12. Just to remind you what it says. Peter urging them in the context of who they are, and therefore reminding us who we are, aliens and strangers. Those outside the house and those outside the people. That's what those two words are. So we are God's people, human beings who name Yahweh as our God. We associate with the Christ. When people call us Christians, it ought to make sense to us that we are Christ followers. So Peter addresses them. He's urging them, admonishing them, encouraging them as aliens and strangers to abstain from, he says, fleshly lusts, which wage war against the soul. Fleshly lusts many times are associated with things like sexual sins. But fleshly lusts incorporate a large tray of items. And yes, sexual sins are involved. I mean, it's clear. I think we all understand lusts. But other things can be included in that. He says in verse 12, keep your behavior excellent among the nations, the Gentiles, so that in the thing in which they slander you, and that's of course a false accusation, or an accusation, I tell you, everywhere we went back there, I don't know whether it was the law or not, but everywhere we went, CNN was on. And you just your eyes kind of roll in opposite directions. And we had a hard time digesting our breakfast because they had that on, and we kept sitting there at our little table laughing and saying, are you kidding me? Because this is news. This is what they call, anyway, whoops. Okay. All right. In which they slander you as evildoers. I don't know how news people can even survive from day to day without 100% lawsuits because of the fabrications they say. But there you go again, Wayne. You got to stay on task right here. Okay? Slander you as evildoers. They may, on account of your good deeds, as they observe them, glorify God in the day of visitation. And remember, we concluded with that. It's either that I'm standing here as a follower of Jesus Christ because I saw him, because I saw her. I observed them. I observed how they responded, and it just transformed me. I mean, obviously it was because of Jesus, and that's what I saw, and that's what I responded to. The other is in the day of visitation, the day of judgment, when everything's too late, God asks, and they cannot, there is no lie there, says, okay, so point to the person that you knew was a Christ follower, and you said, not interested. I saw it and I rejected it because I love darkness. And they point to him or her. So either way, God's going to get the glory through our lives. And that's what Peter's saying. So with that then, he moves into one of the major items in our lives. Government, authority over us. And verses 13 through 17 gives us, if nothing else, gives us something to ponder on in our walk with Jesus every day. Now there's some words in here that are a little bit surprising. Our English translations, for the most part, do a decent job. But there are still, nevertheless, some surprises. The first thing out the gate is be subject to, or submit yourselves. It is the word, we've seen it before, it's to stand under. And typically we see that in subjection or submission to, under the laws of God. Well, Peter's taking that word now, and he's using it here. It's a passive, but without going into a lot of other things, it's almost used as a middle tense, which means that we are involved in the result of submitting ourselves. So when we are subject to whatever Peter's going to say here, we're going to be involved in the results of that submission. Well, what is it that Peter starts out with by saying, place yourselves under? It is and this is you got to figure out what this is. Every human institution. The word institution comes from the I don't want to say creation, because that's creation has a connotation in our mind, but it's from a formation or a foundation, a framing. And so you see, just take for example a globe with no skin on it, just a round thing, and it's the framing, right? It's the framing of the globe. So there's going to be wires around it forming a circular thing, but you're not going to know where England is, for example, because it's not on there. So what is this human institution or this human framing? Well, within the context, we understand that it's dealing with governments, because he begins in the very first out the gate illustration with the king. But before we get there, we have to deal with something else. He says, subject yourselves to every human framework or framing, and then he says, through the Lord. Now, it's that particular phrase is translated differently in every translation. It's for the Lord's sake, because of the Lord, and those things work, but sometimes I'm frustrated because the word there isn't because. And it doesn't actually say for the Lord's sake. It actually says through the Lord. And I've struggled with that because I respect the translations that I use. And for the Lord's sake is what the New American Standard says. And yet it says through the Lord. So is that like some new revelation? Or does it work within the framework of what Peter is saying? Subject yourselves to human frameworks or institutions through the Lord. Why would we want to do that necessarily through our own framework? I know me. I'm not bright enough to figure some things out. But I also know my God. And we just did one aspect of that with the communion table. We know our God has a redemptive spirit, a missionary spirit within him to share with his human creatures, to bring them into relationship with himself. So as I look in my relationship to my world, which includes my government, or the institution we have, which is called a republic, becoming closer to a democracy, becoming closer to, don't go there, Wayne. Okay, I'll stop. I have to do that through him who dwells within me. I deal with my government in the appropriate way through the whole spirit of where Peter was going in verses 11 and 12. What's best for God through you in this world? You, Wayne, subject yourself to every human framework, institution, government, through the Lord. And if there was a Greek scholar, teacher standing here today, he conceivably would say, well, the reason the New American Standard said for the Lord's sake, and the NIV said the same thing, and actually Weiss says the same thing, and Lenski says the same thing, so Wayne Lidbeck says through the Lord, and I mean, I don't like to choose between me and all these other scholars, but I have to read what I read, and it says through the Lord, and that's the way I'm going to take it. For the Lord's sake works as an end result, because if I go along and I thumb my nose at the human institution, then for the Lord's sake has been sidelined. But I like to think of it as it states it, that this happens, my attitude and my response happens because of the Lord, through him, from me into the world. So he jumps then into this illustration or the example, he says whether, because he has whether there because we're going to have another whether in verse 14, whether the king as supreme or superior. That's top dog. To hold above, to be higher, superior, and as you look at a king, there is no one higher. Of course, now we have other forms of government. England has a queen, but they also have parliament, and the queen is not above parliament. So, but in the generic sense of how he uses the word king, and that's interesting too, because Romans had I don't want to say a phobia, they had they would simply not call their leader Rex. They got rid of Rex. They got rid of kings. They did way back at the beginning of the Republic. So the Romans would never call the emperor king. But the Greeks, or those who were influenced by the Greeks, which would therefore be those to the east of Rome and Italy, had no problem calling their leaders Rex, or king, or basileus. So, however you would view this, you would look at the emperor, the president, the king, the chancellor, whatever the top dog was, that's what Peter is looking at. Be subject to every human framework through the Lord, whether to a king as the top dog, or verse 14, whether to governors as having been sent through the king unto two aspects, either vengeance or praise. Vengeance on bad people and praise on good people. And that's really loose. It's doers of baseness, doers of evil, and then doers of good. So we have here, we understand the king, the top dog, whatever you want to call him, and then we understand somebody like Pilate. Pilate was not the emperor. Pilate was the governor. And he could have been called a praetor, a proterator. Okay, I'm not going to get all the names. The governor was there governing on behalf of the emperor, and he made choices. And Peter tells us that, yeah, the emperor's over there. He can't see me, so I don't have to obey him. Well, that guy's smart enough to place a governor over here, and here I am. And the governor, having been sent by him, can either be a giver of retribution to evil or a rewarder of good. And that's kind of just what you would call the facts of life. He doesn't stop there because he wants to say, okay, I've got your attention. Because do you think you guys live in a perfect world? Do you think these people lived in a perfect world? Some of them hunted like dogs because they were Christians. It's like, yeah, doesn't sound perfect to me. And of course, we do have injustices here because we're Christians. And laws made or applied, and laws, okay, let me do this, laws used against us as Christians just because we are Christians and we don't say what they like us to say or do what they like us to do. He moves on into verse 15 and he says, this is the will of God. So now he's going to tell us. Okay, we have the command, and now he stops and he points his finger, he eyeballs his congregation, so to speak, and he says, this is the will of God, that you, by doing good, doing the right thing, may muzzle the ignorance of foolish men. Interesting words here. Several of your translations will have silence. The word actually is muzzle. And we have to make a choice here on whether we would do the metaphor and put to silence, shh, you're saying bad stuff, shh. Or whether it's, I know your heart and I know you're going to bark and attempt to bite, so we're going to muzzle. Nothing has changed in the heart. All that has been stopped is the ability to bite. Now, maybe there's not too much difference in that in your way of thinking, but I think that we should go with the word itself, which is muzzle, that we can muzzle what's happening from these people. And it's interesting about muzzle. I kept trying to think of a good example, and the problem is that I can't think of any good examples where muzzling has worked. And I hate to do it, but I'm going to, because I'm not very bright. I'm going to go back to an illustration from CNN. Back when Obama was president, a guy was in Egypt, and the whatever group that was took over, and he says, so how did Obama help all you people do this? And the guy says, well, he didn't. We don't even know who Obama is, so leave us alone. And he goes to another guy, same thing. Obama had nothing to do with it. And so the guy turns around and says, so we can see here today that Obama had a great impact. And it's like, really, with a straight face you can do that? So that's why I have a problem with seeing how muzzling actually works. I didn't come up with a good illustration. I came up with that, which is a really bad illustration of muzzling, because it didn't work. But the interesting thing about this too, and I really thought what I was going to do with it, because the word here is not foolish men. The word is men without thoughts. Now, do you know how many ways you can interpret that? An empty head works. It does. So foolish works, but it's men without thought. And to muzzle the ignorance of men without thought. I know it has to be a lot going through your brain right now. But that's what Peter says. The will of God for you is that by doing the right thing, the beneficial thing, the good thing, you will actually muzzle these. And there's a reason muzzle is the word. It's because you muzzle a dog because what? It's not just going to bark. It's going to attempt to do this. And the world that hates Christians, period. The world that hates Christians. And this isn't bad to them. So Peter says your good behavior can actually muzzle that. I wish I could have come up with a better illustration. So we're going to go to 16 and 17 where he says free. He says as free people and not as a veil of covering for doing evil. It's interesting that, in the United States, we really do have freedoms. If I had to choose between, let's say, here and Azerbaijan, or Syria, or Egypt, or Saudi Arabia, guess what I would choose? Yes, I would choose this. We have freedom. And it's interesting that in this, Peter, in telling the people how to respond to the governing authorities, he says, you guys live out as free people. So where does freedom really therefore come from? An oppressive government or from God? He's talking to these people and he's referring to them as free people. live within the realm of being as free people. And in that freedom, do not use that freedom as a veil for doing evil. And how many times have in your life somebody come up to you with a smile and you think they're going to say something nice, and it's like they've just taken a knife and you're like a big piece of salami. You're all cut up to pieces because they just cut you to pieces. They were, oh, I just speak my mind. It's like, yeah, you just killed me with your words. How unkind is that? We, in our responses to our government, in our responses, and this will come out in verse 17, in our responses to one another, we don't use the freedom that we have in Jesus Christ in relationship with him as a veil. Because a veil does this. So, I mean, you could probably tell because you can see my cheeks, but am I smiling or am I frowning? A veil, you won't necessarily know. You won't be able to see the truth. So, in my freedom, I can't use that freedom as something that would inhibit or change what is real. And if I have a bad attitude, that's real. If I have a hateful, malicious heart, that's real. And I can, oh, bless you, brother. My goodness, you're looking so good today. Idiot. So verse 16, I mean, this whole thing, and it's going to come to a head or a conclusion in verse 17. We have to look at who we are in this world, and of course whose we are, but he keeps moving us along down paths that we don't necessarily, we like to complain about how things are. I mean, honestly, today Kathy and I were surprised. We filled up 3 weeks ago and I paid $45. Today I got more gas for less than 40. And I wanted to complain, but I couldn't. This is great. I paid less than $40. He says, use, or rather, instead of our freedom as a veil, it's a freedom as slaves of God. And that's one of those things in Christianity where it's like, in order to live, you die. In order to be free, you live as a slave of God. So we like to be a free people, especially us Americans. We understand, for the most part, what freedoms really are. And the whole concept of being a slave is repulsive to us. And yet, that's what Peter's saying. You, be a slave of God. That's your true freedom. And then he concludes with verse 17. Honor all men. And it reminds me of what Jesus said. Even the world knows how to give a good gift. You know, even the Gentiles know how to, you know, if your son asks for bread, you don't give him a snake or a stone. And that's not a quote, but something like that. And it's easy to honor those we love. It's not easy to honor those we don't love. But Peter doesn't qualify this because the word all is all. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, and that's also not an option. Remember, this is a Christ-centered church, and the other part of that is we love one another. We love one another. So there's no options there. Fear God. I kind of like that. I mean, I don't like it, but I kind of like that. I respect God. I fear God. And then he concludes with the last one, honor the king. And here's the thing. This is not a candy store. I like the Snickers. I don't like the Goobers. I like that. I don't like that. Here's a list of just 4 things that Peter gives, and every one, whether you like it or not, has to be a Snickers bar. I'll choose that. I don't want to. I'll choose that. I don't want to. I'll choose that. I don't want to. I'll choose that. I don't want to, but I'm going to. Because I'm a slave of God, and I have no choice. I really have no choice. I have a choice, but I don't have a choice. I've given this a lot of thought, obviously, I told you that I can either continue this around Easter, and it's like, I don't think so. Do I fully understand it? Fully? I think so. Have I had to work at it? Oh yeah. Do I expect you to just say, oh good, now I understand it, now my life is perfect. I love everything about everything. It's like, well, that's not how real life works. We have to submit to certain things. And the government, the governing institutions over us, and there, by the way, there's a whole number of questions now in relation to these things, like civil disobedience. And what happens if the government stands at the door and says, you know, if you're a Christian, we'll kill you? It's like, well, that's pretty easy. I'm a Christian, so blast away or hang away or shoot away or whatever you're going to do. But what gets harder is when the government says for us to participate in things that goes against our morality in the scriptures. I mean, God's morality, which we embrace. That's when things get really sticky. So, do I have all the answers? No, I don't have all the answers, but I start here. And I think this is fairly clear. And for many of us, there's an attitude adjustment. We're going to have to just look at things, what God says about it, and not necessarily, it's a red hat, it's evil, or it's a red hat, it's good. I mean, we can't just go there. And whatever the other side says about being tolerant, and it's very recognizable that it is not tolerant, does that give us an excuse to be intolerant of certain things? Which will remain nameless because we're out of time.
Oh, please.
Oh no. Well, it's here, and you've seen it and you've heard it. Rome wasn't built in a day, and certainly we're not going to be transformed with just one sermon. So God's got a ways to go, probably in all of us, so he'll get us there. Father, we thank you so much for all that you have accomplished in us. And as soon as we deal with things like governing authorities, you know, we've got some things to think about. So, Lord, allow us to think about those things in terms that would please you and give you the glory. We don't need the glory, Lord. You need the glory. So as we need attitude adjustments or a different perspective, allow us to get there from here. So we desire to give you the glory. We pray that you would get the glory because of us and not in spite of us. May the world rejoice because we are the people of God. We commit our way to you in the name of the Master. Amen.